Good afternoon to you all, to landowners, to land managers, commissioners, businesses, friends of the countryside, people who are here just as they are interested, but all of you, a very warm welcome this afternoon in Brussels to have a discussion on how to set credits for ecosystem services on the international market. And this is a session organized in the framework of the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. The main event is tomorrow, but it's now becoming a tradition that on the afternoon before, that let's say we have a discussion on a specific theme related to the Forum for the Future of Agriculture. What is so typical about the Forum for the Future of Agriculture? Well, the partners we have, they do not always agree. But they agree on one thing, and that is we have to talk. We have to talk for our climate, we have to talk for our biodiversity, we have to talk for our planet. And that's what we also would like to do this afternoon, talk to each other, exchange ideas, have a discussion, and that will be sometimes provocative. And sometimes you will hear something which you don't like, but I would say that's part of the process. This afternoon is organized on one side by the European Landowners Organization, which is an umbrella organization for 65 EU membership organizations for private landowners spread over 25 EU countries. And on the other side, Eurosite, which is a network of land conservation organizations and land managers, an umbrella organization over a number of nature conservation organizations. Together, they have a project which is called the European Networks for Private Land Conservation. And there the idea is exactly to find and to promote a common ground for those networks and to create a joint support for private land conservation. The focus of that project is specifically on the engagement of stakeholders, but also on unlocking the financial support for nature conservation on private land. If you're speaking about the payment and the financial support for nature conservation on private land, then there is a single tool which is of extreme interest. That's the payment for ecosystem services. And I have to say, we are speaking already for, I think, more than 15 years now on ecosystem services and how we can organize a payment for ecosystem services. And up to today, that remains quite often theoretical, while we are still struggling to put that in practice. And for that, it's quite strange that, let's say, for the very first time ever, we see an effort by the European Commission, not by DG Environment, but by DG Agriculture, to set up a payment for ecosystem services. And within the new CAP, we have a specific item which is called carbon farming, where, let's say, we are trying to set up a carbon certification system, but also a valuation system, so that carbon credits can be earned and can be paid for. At the European Landowners Organization, we believe that this should not be the end. Let's say there are many more ecosystem services that private landowners can provide. Biodiversity, fresh air, fresh water. The possibilities are numerous. And wouldn't it be great that at a certain moment, that instead of speaking about agriculture subsidies, that we would be able to speak really about a payment for public goods and public services with public funding. I do think that that would be to the benefit of the private landowner, that would be to the benefit of nature conservation organizations. And let's say it doesn't matter who is providing the ecosystem service. What matters is that whoever is doing it is getting a reward for it. And then, of course, we have a discussion on, can we put a price on nature? Maybe not. But can we say that nature is free? I don't think so. So we will have to find a solution to make sure that nature is not free, and that losing nature is extremely expensive. The only way to do that is by making sure that in one way or the other, those who are doing good to nature are getting a reward for that. And that is exactly the power of ecosystem services. The discussion today, for those of you who took a program, I'm afraid that there are a number of changes on the program. The reason for that, train strikes in Paris, train strikes in London, train strikes in Berlin, a technical train problem in Belgium. For once we are not striking, but anyhow we are participating to the problem. So that makes that the program will be slightly different. The first speaker will come a little bit later in the program as he's late. Others we have changed, but we have made sure that each and every time you're getting someone of the same quality, with the same amount of knowledge, and ready to be provocative and to have a great discussion afterwards. Your moderator today will be Dr. Hilde Egermond. She is as well the Vice President of IUCN. She is the Chairman, the President of the Belgian Biodiversity Platform, and I have to say, I say that with much pleasure, as that was a job I have been doing myself once upon a time. Hilde, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you can hear me well. It's my pleasure to be your moderator today, and it was very nicely introduced by Jürgen, the topic of today, on how to set and how to organize credits for ecosystem services on the international market. And so indeed we will learn about the international experiences, including successful examples, but we will also hear indeed maybe a bit more critical voices, so we'll also learn about the challenges. But we hope that through these discussions that we can all gain a better understanding of the direct impacts of these growing credit markets from a scientific, a global, but also from a user's perspective, which indeed seems key if we want to have these voluntary carbon and biodiversity markets becoming mainstream. As was mentioned by Jürgen, we have several eminent speakers. Their bios are published on the website from the forum, and you also have them in the program. So for the sake of time, I won't expand on it. As mentioned also, we have a few small changes due to the train strikes, most notably Mr. Guillaume Santeny, the president of Plan Bleu, and also Max Bodner, the director Biodiversity at Replanet, cannot be here with us today. But we have a very nice replacement who is Georg Koenig from the startup Kibitz, and I would like to thank him in advance for this last-minute saving of the program. And so what we will do is we'll first have a set of presentations, and then this will be followed by a panel discussion, so then there will be plenty of opportunity for you to ask questions to the panelists, so we really hope that we can have a very rich debate. So having said this, I think we can move to our first speaker. And our first speaker is Ms. Meredith Ricefield. And she is the Director of Sustainability Policy and Strategic Partnerships at Indigo. And Meredith will expand on how to set certificates on the global markets, and most notably how we can actually build integrity, credibility, and also durability into these international markets for credits based on the Indigo experience. So Meredith, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hilda. It's wonderful to be with all of you this afternoon. As she mentioned, my name is Meredith Ricefield, and I focus on strategic partnerships and carbon policy at Indigo. And today I was asked to speak a bit on integrity, credibility, and durability. And I have to say I was delighted to hear all of these topics in the same breath, because each of these feeds the other. We ask project developers in this space to set a high bar for the integrity of their programs. And the market is only credible if we can look across the programs and players and see that high bar met consistently. In turn, then, we need to see that credibility year over year or neither the supply side, the landowners we're talking about, or the demand side, the people purchasing these credits, are going to want to come back to these programs year on year, which means you need that consistent credibility to feed durability. Coming full circle, durability is then one of our core pillars of integrity, so you really can't have one without all of the others. And so I'll speak a little bit about how we're approaching this at Indigo, and we'll dig in on some questions after hearing from some of our other panelists. If we can go to the next slide, I'll just briefly describe our carbon program as having 3 core goals. The first is regenerative agriculture at scale. We know that we need global agriculture to be 40% regenerative practices by 2030 to meet a 1.5 degree scenario. That's a huge ramp up from where we all are today. We want to bring those practices globally to, number 2, draw down carbon. As we switch over to these practices, we see emissions with agriculture fall. We see soils getting healthier and sequestering more carbon and removing it from the atmosphere. But last but not least, we need to make sure that more growers are compensated. These are the folks doing the work on the ground to implement the changes we need to see, and if these programs aren't financially sustainable, they won't be durable. So those are the big things we're looking to accomplish in this program. And to move to the next slide and just talk about what we mean when we describe regenerative agriculture, for the purposes of talking about carbon by Indigo, we are looking to 4 types of practices. The first is planting cover crops, the second is reducing tillage, the third is crop rotation, and the fourth is reducing inputs. And we've stood this up in the US, as you can see on the next slide, and we're in the process of expanding it to new regions. We're engaging on the EU carbon removal certification framework, and we're participating in the framework development process as observers to the expert group that DG Klima has convened. But regardless of which geography this program is applied in, and as you can see, we're trying to apply it globally, there are core pillars of quality that remain the same regardless of the application. And so it's worth running through these live. The first is registry certification. The second is the realness of the impacts. The third is additionality, essentially making sure that the change would not have occurred without the intervention of this particular program or project. We need to know that these changes are permanent, that the carbon that's drawn down out of the atmosphere is going to stay sequestered in those soils. We need to know things are uniquely claimed, otherwise we're working with a deck of cards where we're all holding the same cards, and we need to make sure that these programs have credible co-benefits. So a high integrity program has all of these. A higher integrity market is full of programs that have all of these qualities. And as you can see, this durability aspect is important both on the individual program level, but also on the market level. So as a project developer, we're on the hook for all of these. And as we go to the next slide, I'll ask you to think back to the practices that we just showed. We need to quantify the impact of those practice changes and make sure that the number we arrive at is credible, that we know that the practices are additional, and we look at these through a mix of, if we could go to the next slide, we do some measurement, we do some monitoring, and we do some modeling. And I challenge all of you to say that 3 times fast. So we do a mix of a couple different things. First, we collect data directly from farmers. This is sometimes some of their just management data inputted into our app or our software platform. Sometimes we're looking at weather data in their region. We're doing random soil sampling across the 6 million acres in our US program. And we've done a lot of partnerships to try to directly engage with growers and to make this process a little bit easier. So for example, we've partnered with John Deere so that we can take data directly off of farmers' tractors rather than asking them to input it themselves. And we've worked with partners like Corteva so that a farmer can ideally work with one of their existing partners rather than needing to build some new knowledge, trust, and relationships to navigate the space. We're also verifying these practices through monitoring. So if a farmer says that they tilled on a certain day or if they harvested on a certain day, we're able to go back and check to see how that matches up to our satellite data. Last but not least, all of this flows into some pretty sophisticated biogeochemical models, which I'm not an expert on, but I'm happy to attempt to answer your questions. And we're able to look at what has happened in soils with these practice changes compared to a baseline scenario or what would have happened. So first we have to quantify it. We need to get that realness down. And then on the next side, you'll see that we need to also make sure that those benefits endure. So we do monitoring to see what happens on each and every field and make sure that these practices aren't reversed. We look for both avoidable reversals and unavoidable reversals. An avoidable reversal is when, say, a grower decides to leave the program. An unavoidable reversal is sometimes referred to as a catastrophic event or an act of God, and you're looking at an event like a fire or a flood that takes that field out of the program. We're on the hook for the avoidable reversals, and we manage those mostly through aggregating all the farms and fields in our program. And unavoidable reversals are managed in partnership with the Registry, which takes out a buffer pool of credits across all programs and is able to manage for those catastrophic events accordingly. It's also worth noting that we didn't get here alone, and for a project to be Registry issued, it needs to have gone through this multi-stakeholder process. So we've been at this for a couple of years. We've been engaging farmers since the beginning. It took us a while to engage first the registries and then for them to engage the scientists, NGOs, and other civil society partners that participate in the protocol development process before we could issue our first credits last year. The good news is that we're getting faster at this. So we were able to issue 5 times the credits in half the time with our second issuance just a month ago. So that's very exciting. And as we look at ag as a big picture, on the next slide you can see that the big unlock for agriculture is having these 2 new protocols that are designed to scale. In the past, when we looked at some of the carbon market activity in agriculture, we were looking at protocols that were deeply specific to a single region and perhaps a single crop. So you might have something that only works for rice in India. It doesn't scale up very well. You can't really account for your cover crops when you bring those in. And we know that farmers change what they grow year to year. So a protocol that lets you include multiple crops is a pretty powerful tool. So this hybrid measurement and modeling approach lets you do that kind of multi-crop, multi-geographical, scalable approach. And both of these protocols are really taking off in the larger agricultural space. You can go and look up at either the Climate Action Reserve or Vera and see all the projects that have been listed under that protocol. And if you look at Vera, for example, you'll see dozens of projects that have sprung up in the last couple of years that are taking these methods and putting them into practice. Knowing we're tight on time, I'll just end by talking about the alignment between these protocols and the emerging carbon removal certification framework. There's a lot in here that's building on the existing best practices in the space. What's needed going forward is to harmonize and further drive consistency across all of these different market players so that, one, it's easier for landowners because you're getting the same bars for what makes a high integrity program regardless of which program you choose to join. The second is just that it continues to raise the bar of best practices if you can take some of the best qualities of one registry or program and merge them with the ones that exist elsewhere in the marketplace. There's a little bit of specialization right now, everybody's good at different things, and we're really binding this all together as the carbon market grows. Looking forward to joining the discussion today and hearing from our other panelists. Thank you.
Thank you, Meredith. I think it was nice to hear these very practical examples and experiences from Indigo, and you already pointed to a few challenges that we will also discuss in the panel, I guess, on certification, the co-benefits, additionality, durability, data collection and monitoring, and this engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. So now I will move to our next speaker, and our next speaker is Jörg König. He is the CEO of a startup, the Kibitz, and he will talk about how to construct an ecosystem market, and most notably he will also give a few practical examples of how to value ecosystem services in the context of farmers and foresters. So Jörg, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opportunity to present our startup to you today. So we jumped in like half an hour ago, which is why our presentation, I believe, did not make it into this format here. But I can try to give you some insights off the top of my mind, but I'm not sure whether I will succeed in this. I hold a presentation on that topic actually 3 weeks ago in front of the German Agricultural Society. And the question was, especially targeting farmers and foresters, is environmental protection a business case for land users? And we believe we can answer this question with yes, and I will try to elaborate a bit on that. So, if we look at the history of how farms and also forestry companies evolved over time, we can see that they often adopt their businesses to new circumstances. Especially in Germany, over the last decades, many farmers became very active in renewable energies. As of today, there's many farmers who also operate their business for tourists, who produce cheese. So they have already many more businesses than just the production of crops or wood. So we believe that also environmental protection could be a feasible business case for farmers in the future. And there's actually 4 levels why companies should invest into nature capital. One of them is really simple marketing. So consumers demand ever more companies to produce products which are in some case either carbon neutral, but also in the future nature neutral or nature positive. So there's a strong pressure coming up from the consumer side. Then we have like financial institutions, like for instance, BlackRock and also other banks in Europe who are pushing this topic more and more. So they want that companies can verify that investments into them are sustainable, and it also plays an important role in what interest rate you get as a company if your business is more or less sustainable. Then obviously there's physical risks. So we've seen in Germany like devastating floods in the last years, and this is also something you can try to prevent with functioning ecosystems. And last but not least, there's the, especially in Europe, the regulation. The CSRD is coming into action, I believe, next year, or like from the business year next year onwards. Companies have to report on the business action when it comes to CO2, but also biodiversity, water circles, and so on. So like all the business activity is being monitored ever closer. And this puts a lot of pressure also on the agricultural and forestry value chains. The market is quite big, so it's expected, there's a study from the European Commission from, I believe, 2020, and they expect the market for nature capital to be, at the moment, around 120 billion euros, and it's expected to grow 3 times until the end of the decade, so we will have like a market of 360 billion euros. And also we see a big shift from public funding, so like in Europe it's the cap, to private funding. So the share of private funding for nature services will be about 40% by the end of this decade. And as I am supposed to speak on how to build this market, I believe it's really important to have a digital infrastructure that caters both, so the land users and also the companies. And when I talk about companies, at the center of our attention are those companies that are most closely related to land use, which are construction companies, food companies, paper companies, maybe in the context of forestry. And we have to, so we did like many interviews with probably the 30 biggest companies in Germany who produce food or paper, and asked them, what do you need if you have to invest in nature markets? And like most of them, they don't even know what that is. Ah, look at that, that's my presentation. But I don't have, okay. Should I come up there? Oh. So yeah, can you, actually I believe I have, unfortunately it's in German as well, because I did it in German the other time. So maybe we can, that's great. So yeah, I mean, like if you talk about nature capital, you might ask yourselves, what is that? And actually it's quite simple, because all these measures we need, they're already known from the governmental programs we have. Could be flower strips, could be dead wood in the in the forest, could be hedge planting, could be agroforestry. So all these measures we already now have to be integrated in productive agriculture and forestry systems in order to make this work. And looks like I can't proceed. Yeah, anyway, so no worries. So yeah, actually companies, what you need to give them is a solution which actually solves all their problems. So you have to tell them the current ecosystem footprint, you have to look at the value chain and say, well, for instance, you're a liquor producing company and your main ingredients are, let's say, sugar beet and wheat. We have a pilot project with this kind of company at the moment. You have like, I don't know, 10,000 tons of sugar beets, then you deduct, well, how much hectares of land do you need in order to produce this amount of sugar beet? And then we have scientific partners in Germany, 2 NGOs and a university, and we calculate, we deduct the necessary measures these companies should finance in order to make their value chain more nature positive. And these can then be translated in measures like this, also in intercropping and so on. So actually, the sugar beet gets a bit more expensive as on some area of the fields, the farmers producing that sugar beet for the companies, measures like these are conducted. I talked about that stuff already. I mean, this one is, most of you would already know it, but for farmers it's quite interesting because it's another strong argument why you should start producing environmental protection on your farm. Because if you look at the wheat price here, Matif in Paris, it's very volatile. And if you bring in more business cases for your farm, you can balance out your farm income, which is really nice. This is actually a study we conducted with the German NABU, it's like the Nature Conservancy Association in Germany, and the consulting company BCG, and it shows that if you switch to regenerative practices, it's quite hard to generalize this number, but you could have monetary yield improvements of up to 60%, which is a really strong number. Obviously, it depends a lot on where you're based, if you have fertile land or less fertile land, but so it can be a business case in itself to produce environmental protection on your farm. I'll skip that. I mean, that's what I already said. It's important because if you don't have working environmental or ecosystems, like this one is from China, I believe, you have to make your apple trees produce apples by hand. You don't have bees anymore, like the floods. And this is quite nice. This is a number of the World Economic Forum in Davos. And if you look at that, each euro you invest into nature capital results in €9 output. So that's a pretty nice business case here. This one I already told you. So talking about how to create credits, I believe the biggest challenge actually when we talk about biodiversity is how to measure and monitor biodiversity. Because with carbon it's quite easy, you just have tons of CO2 you either produce or you don't produce or you compensate somehow. But with biodiversity, we don't have that. So as of today, there's 2 possibilities. One of them is result-based, and there's already many companies trying to solve that. You could either use remote sensing, so satellites looking at landscapes and trying to assign a monetary value to a certain piece of land. There's the concept of eDNA, which means you take samples of soil and water, you analyze that, and then you can deduct the status of the ecosystem at a given location by analyzing these samples. And obviously, like in the upper left, you can also send out people who take notes in the field, but that's not really viable because it's a really cost-intensive and a waste of money, basically. But you would need it in the first place. And the other one is what we are starting with is action-based. So you assign a value to certain measures. So you say, for instance, a hedge in a particular region, let's say northern Germany, has usually certain effects on the ecosystem, certain CO2 effects, certain biodiversity effects, certain water effects, and then you can kind of estimate the value of a measure and thus could also deduct ecosystem credits from that value. But it's not very, you want to go to the result-based system in the future, and we are already working on in different research projects part of working groups in order to achieve that, but it's still some way to go. For the industry, there's already some tools available. For instance, the biodiversity risk filter is produced or was issued by the WWF, like the nature NGO. There's also on European level, there's the TNFD, there's the Science Based Targets Network. So there's many people who are trying to solve this. But as of today, anyone who sells you ecosystem credits is selling you bullshit, in my opinion, because there's no scientific proof for that so far. So what we have to start with is assumptions, and if we always put the disclaimer, well, this is just an assumption, it's good. And I believe it's really important to start now in order to bring things into action, but like there is no provable ecosystem credit so far. This is quite interesting in my opinion, because it shows what we would have to do in the German state of Lower Saxony in order to restore our ecosystem, and it's quite a lot. So if you want to stop biodiversity loss, you would need 15% of the land in Lower Saxony with the actions I showed you in the beginning. So on 50% of the land, we would need hedges, agroforestry systems, flower strips, and so on, in order to stop the biodiversity loss. And to really rebuild our ecosystem, we would need between a quarter or a third of the agricultural landscape with these measures. So what we can see here, if we really want to restore our ecosystems, we need a lot of money, and we need the farmers and foresters, we need to convince them to act with us, because otherwise we won't achieve that. And yeah, but this is like the strongest argument, in my opinion, why it's wise to invest into nature capital. And also from a financial point of view, if you look at the development of carbon credits, they were way cheaper like some years ago. So also if you're just thinking in numbers, probably it's cheaper to buy ecosystem credits now than in a few years, if they exist. Yeah. And yeah, this is, I mean, I don't know, do we have any time left, or is 2 minutes? Okay, so I'd like to make some advertisement for our startup. Like this is like how we believe it could be practically implemented for farmers. So you go on our platform, you dial in your zip code, and the tool knows where you are, and then you can see as a farmer or forester, well, in my region I could do an agroforestry project sponsored by Nestlé, for instance. Then you can see, well, I would get 500 euros, I have to do certain measures until the end of June. You can plan the project in your farm. You can also upload your shape files, like the files you already have in your governmental subsidy application. And yeah, that's basically it. And then we have another app where you can monitor already with your smartphone that you implemented those measures. You can get paid for that. And we believe it's most important to make it as unbureaucratic as possible, because that's like the biggest roadblocker for farmers and foresters today, that the governmental funding is so complicated to get. I tried it on my own farm, under 30 years old, and still I almost failed. It's really complicated. In Germany, every county has its own understanding of what should be done in, I don't know, east of Berlin, and probably it's not so different from what you should do in Holland or somewhere else. So yeah, it's a mess. And so what we really need, if we want to scale investment in nature capital, is easy transactions, digital tools, and yeah, and also like the control pressure by the government. Yeah, so many farmers in Germany, and I believe in the rest of Europe as well, they're afraid of taking action because like a few years later there might be some environmental NGOs telling, well, it's nice you have planted this hedge, but now you really have like the population of some rare bird, and now we take all the land and you can't use it anymore. And we have to avoid that too. That's really a shout out to the politicians, because if we don't solve this issue, there won't be anyone willing to implement measures like that. Yeah, I already told you we have really nice pilot projects. Also one in planning with Future Forest in Harz Mountains. This one is for agriculture. We are planning to extend our system for forestry as well. And yeah, obviously look different on my MacBook for, but yeah, thank you so much. And if you have any questions, please approach me. And yeah, thanks for the opportunity to present our startup last minute here.
Brilliant, with and without slides. So I think it gave us also a very good understanding of the complexity to quantify ecosystem services, and then how this relates to what can be collected by landowners and managers, and also indeed pointing to the importance of biodiversity monitoring using these more innovative tools, and then how this can be used by the private sector. And I think we heard you well, that we still have a long way to go when it comes to biodiversity credits, but it seems not impossible. So that nicely brings me to the next speaker, who is Mr. Cristi Gergicianu. So now we actually will move to the experience from a conservation organization, from a nature NGO. And Cristi is the executive president of the Fundația Adept Transylvania, and that's a Romanian non-profit dedicated to protecting Transylvanian biodiversity and traditional agriculture through innovation and education. So Cristi, the floor is yours.
Hello, thank you for the introduction and thank you for the invitation. I was paying attention to the previous speaker and I was thinking a lot of people, they are fighting to get the biodiversity back, and in Transylvania we are fighting to keep the biodiversity. So we have it and we try to fight and keep it there. So yes, we are a small NGO. Our mission is to protect high nature value grasslands of Transylvania, working with the farming communities that created them, and they are trying to work with the communities because it's a large area and okay. So this rich biodiversity, it's man-made biodiversity, so we need to work with them in order to maintain this rich landscapes. And I was just... I tried all of them. Should I? Always female touch. So, as an NGO, we are working in southeast Transylvania. It's right in the middle of Romania. It's SPA and also an SCI area. Just some pictures from Romania, spring, summer, autumn. You can see the landscape, the mosaic landscape that we are trying to protect. But as I mentioned, there are a lot of threats. And if 10 years ago, the main threats were intensification and abandonment, intensification by applying the artificial fertilizer, which drastically reduced flower plant population, and use of increasingly large machinery, which reduces the mosaic landscape, reduces the mosaic management of the landscape. These days we have a different type of threat, which is plowing of permanent grasslands. So there is an increased threat, and you can see in the upper part it's the SCI compared with the lower part, part of the Hărtibaciu area. The arable land increased a lot, and it's a threat that we can see it day by day, especially this year, and this is due to a number of factors. I will say the main factor, it's agro-environment payments. We are at the end of the previous programming period, and now the new programming period is not so interesting for the farmers anymore. So they are looking for I don't know, increasing their profits, and agro-environment payments are not interesting enough for them anymore. So they are going for crops. It's also, I think, the agro-environment is quite bureaucratic, The contracts are maximum 5 years, which are actually quite a short time in farming life. In order to simplify the system, 2/3 of landowners are excluded from state to payment scheme because the amount of land they own is too small. So we are talking about very small scale farmers in our area, and the land is scattered in different places, and this is due to, you know, when they, after the communism, when they got the land back, they got small pieces in different places, a little bit of hay meadows, a little bit of grazing area, arable lands, so different small parcels in different areas. And also, in order to simplify the state payment system, there are many highly perceptive requirements that are actually contrary to biodiversity conservation. For example, fixing an earliest mowing date does not allow for local and annual variation in weather patterns, contrary to agriculture good practice. So they are called agro-environment payments, but from our point of view, they don't look into the biodiversity and agro-environment. They look more into the management aspects of the agro-environment of the measure. Also, some other requirements are to clean pastures of all the scrub, without which the area will not receive payment. So it's another bad practice, and local authorities sometimes they cut the payments to small farmers if they clear the hedges or if they clear scrub on their land. Furthermore, the state payment scheme do not directly measure and value the carbon and biodiversity results of management. So, as I mentioned, they only look on, you know, if the land is clear, how many animals you have on the hectare, but nothing about carbon sequestration and biodiversity. So in the last 10 years, we worked with OPOL. Unfortunately, our colleagues Tim Coles and Max, they couldn't make it for today. But we're working with them for 10 years now in our area. They were doing a lot of biodiversity monitoring in the area, and gathering all this data, we decided that it's time to use the data and to develop a biodiversity carbon credit scheme. And for the moment, we are looking into 2 pilot areas in our area. There are 2 plots, 1,500 hectares each, collecting a lot of data. Hopefully this year we'll have an answer from the certification body, and hopefully this year we'll have the first carbon credit contracts, hopefully by the end of this year. Unfortunately, Max was the technical guy, but I can make sure that all the technical data, if you are interested, we can. I'm sure we can provide through our colleagues from ELO, because they are, you know, available for everyone who is interested. How the farmers reacted to this? We are working a lot with the farmers, and they are very happy because it's the first time we are talking about long-term contracts. We talked about 20, 25 years contract. And also, you know, it's because of the predictability. It's not only 5 years and then nobody knows what is going to happen. It's a longer term. And also the systems that we hope to have in place should be easier to use compared with the agro-environment payments, for example. So trying to make life easier from a bureaucracy point of view. Very straightforward, clear, and quite a lot of visits, monitoring visits on the fields every 3 to 5 years for checking the biodiversity and checking the carbon in the ground. So sorry, I'm not the technical guy, but as I mentioned, I will send all the information that you need about our scheme and all the technical data behind the scheme that we are preparing. Thank you very much, and see you later.
So now I will introduce our next speaker, who is Mr. He's the policy coordinator at the European Commission at DG Klima, and he will share with us his views on the topic, also expanding on the situation in Europe, and also how these credits fit into the European strategies.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. Apologies for the delay. I was scheduled to speak earlier, but then I had the opportunity to link with this interesting project at the last slides you presented the certification. What we'll do, in fact, is to present the proposal for a regulation on carbon removal certification. And I understand this seminar, this conference is about biodiversity, but biodiversity and climate change are very much interlinked. And in fact, we want to make sure that by promoting carbon removals, increased carbon removals, we also support not all other environmental objectives like biodiversity, but also the income, additional income for land managers across Europe. This is the broader picture about why do we need to increase carbon removals. This slide shows the map. You might have seen it already. This is basically the emissions in Europe going down, the objective of 2030, the objective of climate neutrality by 2050. You can see on this slide basically the orange, that's the reduction of emissions, and then the green is the carbon removals that needs to be increased significantly in order to compensate unavoidable emissions from some sectors, such as agriculture, industry, or some of the long-term, long-distance transportation. So we'll need both. Of course, the priority right now, and always will be the priority to reduce emissions, but there are some emissions that cannot be reduced, and therefore they need to be compensated by an increase in carbon removals, and that is the climate neutrality goal. What do we talk about? What do we mean by the word carbon removals? So you are very familiar, I guess, with carbon farming. Carbon farming is the term that covers both carbon removals, so absorption of carbon from the atmosphere through biomass, through forest, and through soils. So that's these kind of projects that have, of course, also lots of co-benefits for biodiversity. And these projects are happening in our forests, are happening in our agricultural soils, in our farms. But then we have also what we call a permanent, which is more industrial carbon removal through bioenergy-based carbon capture and storage, or even more emerging technologies like direct air capture and storage, which are very big machines that are sucking carbon out of the atmosphere and storing underground. Very initial emerging technologies, but with a lot of perspectives. And then, of course, carbon storage in long-lasting products, because thanks to wood, for example, in construction, we can store carbon in buildings or in long-lasting products. These are the three big families of carbon removals that we are trying to address through our certification framework. So what is the certification framework? I might disappoint you. This is not all the policy on carbon removals. This is just a first step to set up a monitoring, reporting, and verification tool to understand how much carbon we are removing out of the atmosphere. There's a lot of discussion about carbon removals, but there is not yet I would say European, not even a global standard and methodology on how to quantify carbon removals. So that's our first step. In order to I've already been told that you need to first measure something in order to promote it. So we will try to measure through established methodologies. So here you see the 4 objectives of the Commission proposal: setting up a monitoring, verification, and a reporting tool, which will be operationalized through certification methodologies tailored to the 3 different families and different carbon removal activities. And this will enable trust in carbon removals and fight a lot of the greenwashing we're having right now in the market, and harmonize market conditions. So here you see a basically summary of the different articles and main chapters of the regulation that was adopted by the Commission in November last year and is currently into the interinstitutional negotiations. So it's currently being discussed by Parliament, Council. Last week, Environmental Council had a first exchange of views. The ambition, but I cannot guarantee that, is to have this carbon removal certification regulation adopted before the end of the current mandate, legislative mandate. So then we can have the basis then to develop the certification methodologies and start certification on the ground, which is what we all want, to see real action. So this, in a nutshell, what is the certification? The certification sets up what are the high-level quality criteria to identify high-quality, credible carbon removals. So it defines how to quantify carbon removals. There needs to be additional, so we want to promote carbon removal that go beyond the business as usual. They have to somehow ensure and promote the long-term storage as much as possible, knowing that there are differences between industrial removals and land-based removals. And we cannot compare both, because industrial removals can store, in some cases, carbon for centuries. Land removal can do as well, but also are more subject to natural disturbances and the risk of reversal. So we want to promote both because we need both, but we need to also be very transparent about the characteristic of both. And then, of course, sustainability. We want to make sure the carbon removals do not lead to significant harm to environment. On the contrary, do support our environmental objectives such as nature, restoration, and biodiversity. How to do that? We translate these quality criteria through tailored certification methodologies that will be adopted by the Commission through what we call delegated acts, more implementing regulations, because they are very technical. They're very, they can be a bit nerdy kind of methodologies on how to certify carbon removals. But we do that in a transparent and very inclusive way. I mean, this is a very emerging area of work, not much on the land, because there's been a lot of experience, but also on the industrial technologies, a lot to be done. On the carbon storage and lost-lasting product, there is a lot of methodological questions still to be addressed. So we have set up an expert group, including over 70 experts from different European countries, experts on carbon removal, coming from industry, from academia, NGOs, and they will assist the Commission in developing such a methodologies. We had the first meeting on the 7th of March, which set a very good start. And by the way, all the proceedings of these expert group meetings will be web streamed. So thanks to the new technology, we'll ensure maximum transparency. And once we develop the the certification methodologies, then they will be applied through a set of certification rules, and we very much build on existing experience under European framework, such as the Renewable Energy Directive or the Organic Agriculture, where the Commission approves private certification schemes or public certification schemes. Basically, certification schemes that needs to be credible and that will be scrutinized by the Commission, approved, and then we'll start then certifying carbon removal projects on the ground. And this is how the process will work. So these are the criteria. Going a bit too fast, perhaps. Quantification, additionality, long-term storage, and sustainability. We can build on a lot of the existing regulation here. This is a well-known criteria, high-level principle that have been discussed at international level. The key question will be how to implement that for the different carbon removal technologies, because these criteria, just take the long-term storage, for example, how you create liability rules and systems to promote the long-term storage can vary significantly if you're talking about a forest project or if you're talking about an industrial plant using direct air carbon and capture. So on that, we'll need a tailored approach, knowing that the key principles and the rules will be set in the legislation, in the regulation approved by Parliament and Council, hopefully. And the rule of verification, as I said, there is a key requirement of third-party verification of the claim made by the operators. Operators is a broad term covering landowners, covering industrial operators, and covering construction operators that you will use wood. They will need to, we will have certification schemes, and we plan already to build on, exploit the synergies with the existing schemes. Under the Renewable Energy Directive, we have a number of schemes already certifying land criteria for biomass, and there are a lot of synergies there when we think about biomass used under carbon removals or overall agricultural products. And of course, a key objective of this initiative is to provide information for the public, for the buyers, for the investors, and this will be done through certificates of compliance. The certificate of compliance is a document that will include all the information regarding the project. So how much carbon, additional carbon this project has been, is removing, for how long, with which sustainability and co-benefit for the environment. So then everyone, what we currently missing in the market right now is a standard for transparency. There are very different standards, sometimes not harmonized, and also there is a lot of greenwashing. This cannot be afforded if people are putting money, sometimes private, sometimes public, taxpayer money into carbon removals. We want to make sure that there is the biggest added value. And this is how the scheme would work, with the Commission responsible for developing the certification methodologies. The certification schemes, either public or private, a key role to play in order to implement the criteria and manage the certification process, with a key role by certification bodies. Certification bodies will be the auditors on the ground certifying a project in Romania, in Bulgaria, in Italy, in Spain, and so on and so forth. What I presented to you is just, as I said, a first step towards a bigger policy on carbon removals, which is composed of different milestones, and you have them here. The climate law, by basically July 2024, the Commission is required to come forward with a proposal for a 2040 target. Which might also look at the role of carbon removals. Then we have two review clauses, which are very much interlinked, regarding permanent storage, whether the Commission will have to come with a report by 2026 also on the opportunities as well as challenges, and on the potential inclusion of permanent, and I would like to underline permanent, because the co-legislators have been very clear, only permanent carbon removals could eventually be integrated under an ETS. But we have also a role for land-based, less permanent, but very important carbon removals for carbon farming. There is also a review clause about their role under the LULUCF regulation. So we are just at the beginning of a much broader policy debate on the role of carbon removals, and therefore also the public incentives that might be put on a table for promoting further action on carbon removals. When we are talking about the voluntary corporate claims and the so-called voluntary carbon market and the role of carbon removals in that market, we have two other pieces of legislation which are setting up a very clear rules, and hopefully will address a lot of the greenwashing and provide and support new projects, credible projects, is the EU Sustainability Reporting Standards and the Green Claims Directive proposal for a directive which was just adopted last week by the Commission. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think your presentation made clear that there's quite a bit that we can learn from the carbon market experience, also in relation to the monitoring, the reporting, the verification, and the certification. And also when it comes to the EU regulation, I assume we'll have to go through all these steps while making it fit for purpose. It's simply not a copy-paste, I assume. That actually brings me to the last speaker of today, and that is Mr. Luc Groot. And he is board secretary and advisor for the Dutch Federation of Private Landowners, and he will expand on the challenges and the opportunities from a landowner's perspective. No problem.
1 second, I'm sorry. Of course, the technique is not working. Wait. Sorry. Thank you for giving me the floor and a chance to reflect upon the discussion and the challenges for landowners. My name is Luc Groot. As I said, I work for the Dutch Federation of Private Landowners as an advisor and board secretary. And let's be clear, developing biodiversity and carbon credit systems are crucial in the fight against climate change and to achieve climate neutrality by 2050. Landowners wholeheartedly support the process of creating a robust voluntary market for carbon removals, built on existing schemes. This last part is important, I think, for landowners. Not too much new obligations and opportunities, please. Shape it as an opportunity and not as an obligation. In general, in the Netherlands, farmers and landowners feel more and more obliged by governments to take new steps which limits ownership. For example, no forestry production allowed anymore in certain regions, less and less hunting possibilities. This is very tiring and detrimental for support by landowners' communities. Back on the topic, of course there's a reason to create a market for climate change and biodiversity. The challenge is real, and governments and companies should cooperate with land managers, as they are the only ones who can remove carbon and offset the growing CO2 emissions caused by EU society as a whole. Landowners are not the problem, they will provide the solution. Yesterday I was listening to a podcast on carbon farming in North America, which is already further ahead on this topic. And this helped me, together with the forum today and practices in the Netherlands, to formulate some main takeaways, which was the request for developing sound biodiversity and carbon credit structures and policies in future. First of all, I think communication is very important. In communicating with landowners when developing carbon markets for biodiversity and carbon credits, companies and governments should not focus on a single issue or techniques, but focus on healthy waters, soil, and air, and give them possibilities, and at the same time help landowners to maintain yields, income, and ways to bridge extra costs which new regulations will bring with them. This is the way you convince landowners. Just telling landowners we must do this because of the Paris Agreement or the Commission's set up a voluntary carbon market is not a convincing argument on its own. In that sense, for us, it's very important to provide more funds for informing and communicating with landowners on new developments like these, and to roll out the carbon and biodiversity market. And this can be done via ELO, but also, for example, via associations in individual countries. Secondly, it's important when developing the carbon market and other schemes, make sure that landowners keep as much ownership of the land as possible. They are responsible and want to take responsibility. Make sure there is also clarity on fiscal consequences when receiving payments for carbon or biodiversity. And also think about certain aspects as what will carbon credits or biodiversity mean for the land value. Value is very important. Land value is very important for finance for landowners. So that's also an important takeaway I would like to provide. Furthermore, I think it has been said a few times, it's very important and crucial to provide long-term perspectives and financial certainty for landowners when setting standards in the carbon or biodiversity markets. Most politicians and companies tend to focus on very short-term time frames and gains. Landowners don't. They focus on maintaining and manage their land for the next generation. If you cannot give a guarantee for at least 20 years to provide finance, it is in general not very interesting for landowners. In the Netherlands, you now have 6-year schemes for agricultural nature management as an alternative, which I think is a good start, but we need to build upon this long-term perspective for landowners and farmers. Fourthly, make sure that front runners who already invested in carbon sequestration or biodiversity are being rewarded. For example, in forestry, many landowners already replanted or diversified. Will they receive benefits in a carbon credit market in the future? It's very important to keep the support for these kinds of new initiatives. The provision of carbon credit payments creates economic benefits for landowners, no doubt, to engage in carbon sequestration activities. It's still a difficult word. This is of course true, but I think the biggest problem is the fact that farmers and landowners are still mainly price takers, and they provide many societal benefits, but cannot earn a proper living. On average, a farmer in the EU earns 50% of what any other worker in the economy earns. So we still need a fundamental review of our policy framework and funding of landowners, and this can help. But also we need to discuss on easing state aid for farmers and landowners, for ecosystem services, for example, and tax environmental harming practices with companies and consumers much more. So we can also prioritize these kind of schemes better and provide more finance for these schemes. And in the end, to make it work for landowners and for forestry owners. Last point, I think what's already been said before is about the monitoring, reporting and verification. I think in the past when we set up new schemes, new mechanisms, we often forget to give enough incentives to cover associated costs with monitoring, reporting and verification. And I think this is very crucial to make these kind of markets work. So that would be also a very important takeaway from our side. Then, these were my takeaways. And then I have a few questions for the panel to get the panel started. First of all, of course you see different ecosystem services and they pose different challenges regarding how they should be valued. You have food, fiber, carbon sequestration, pollination, water regulation. But how can this be resolved and put in one simple system, which is understandable for also the end users and the ones who have to produce the services? Secondly, pricing mechanisms will decide whether it will make sense for landowners to invest for credits. How should landowners be informed about prices? How do they get the information they need? And then the third question I would like to ask is, it's about additionality. I think it's already been said in one of my points. How can credits be beneficial for landowners who already well manage nature and already invested a lot in nature management? Thank you.
Thank you. I think you added a few more elements to the discussion, pointing to the needs for these incentives to roll out the carbon and the biodiversity markets. That will possibly imply, indeed, revision of the financial schemes. You also referred to the importance of ownership and also to this long-term perspective. So I think this gives us a good basis for the discussion. So with this, we will close the presentations. And I would like to invite the speakers to come on stage for the panel discussion. Strikes, all the seats are filled, so far so good. So maybe before we ask for questions from the audience, and also maybe going back to some of the questions that were posed by Luc. Maybe asking the speakers if there's any quick reaction that they would like to give based on what they have heard.
Does it work? Yeah. Yeah, I believe like basically all three questions you posed point to one direction, which is we need proper monitoring systems. Because proper monitoring systems enable proper markets. They also lead to the valuation of existing practices. So what we really need is a system that gives you an indicator of the value of a piece of land. And if we would have that, we wouldn't have the question of additionality anymore, because then you could also honorate someone who has done well in the past. So yeah, I believe technology is what we need in order to solve all the three issues you mentioned, basically. Yeah.
I also want to add something. I think it's also important to make sure that when we do the monitoring, to make sure we take in consideration also the geography, the specificity of the area, not trying to, I don't know, level it for the whole Europe. Try even to do it in each country, to have it on, I don't know, biogeographical regions or so on, because we lose a lot of specificity and we have experience with a lot of agro-environment payments, for example.
If I may pick up on that, because you started with monitoring, and you just mentioned the fact that it needs to be site-specific. That's very interesting, because this is very echoing the discussion we're having right now in Council and Parliament regarding the proposal from the Commission, and particularly the setting up of baselines, because of course the carbon removals will be measured against that baseline, baseline being the business usual. What we are proposing, in fact, is I would say limited administrative burden for the operators, because the baseline will be set by the Commission through the certification methodologies, and our ambition is to set, provided data is available, highly sophisticated or representative baselines which represent operators in the same conditions, in the same climatic, pedoclimatic, environmental conditions, so that they are checked against, I mean, the carbon removals, additional carbon removals are based on the specific situation. And that we also, by this way, we can reward the those that have taken already action. Thanks, a lot of these will be allowed, will be available through the improved use of Earth observation. And nowadays there are lots of can be used in order to, in fact, in some countries you can able to monitor each parcel. And our ambition is to make sure that this is scaled at European level, so that we don't use baselines based on national or regional averages, which are very inaccurate tool, but we go more at the level of the individual parcel.
I will happily add to that. So I think you're touching on this issue of the need to customize all of these different programs, the unique needs of an individual region or even an individual landowner. And that is something that we've definitely spent a lot of time trying to figure out, because one, you have very different soil profiles region to region and from one field parcel to another. And then when you start to build in the wide range of options that someone might choose to pursue with how to manage their land, there's a lot of difference in between someone who's just getting started with cover cropping or with crop rotation versus someone who's a decade into that work and perhaps gotten very sophisticated with their approach. So being able to look at those specifics and to be able to look at it really field by field is going to be critical to both understanding what's literally happening on and in the ground, and to being able to properly compensate landowners for the changes that they're implementing.
We have heard during the presentations, and a couple of things are repeated here. We start from a baseline, we are going to do monitoring, and in the end we want to take a long-term commitment. And I would say that is more or less the summary of why private landowners are so much interested in this instrument. Because, let's say, I always make the difference between a private landowner farmer and a farmer tenant. The private landowner, the land is capital. For a farmer tenant, it's a commodity. Now, as a private landowner farmer, let's say, most of them have a baseline. The baseline is the way they got the land from the former generation. And then they do the monitoring because they want to be sure that for the next generation, the land is going to go to the next generation, even with a higher quality of land. And exactly because of that, let's say, an instrument like carbon farming, but also other credits, is of interest to private landowners.
Thank you. Maybe before I open up, quickly coming back to one of the questions that you posed, also in terms of this additionality that we talked about in the presentations as well. So to the speakers, I don't know who will answer, but how can these credits be beneficial for landowners with already well-managed nature?
So I think an important context for this piece of the conversation is to remember what a carbon credit or a broader ecosystem credit is specifically designed to do, which is to look at what happened in a specific domain. It could be within a specific field parcel, it could be the aggregate of multiple fields in a project, and to be able to credibly account for that change. If you're very mature already in regenerative agricultural practices, there may not be as much change on the table. And so a carbon credit or other ecosystem credit approach may not be the right approach for you. However, that doesn't mean that these particular landowners, who I would describe broadly as early adopters, are completely left out of the broader sustainability conversation. In tandem to the discussion we're having here today, there's an incredible amount of work that's advancing in how we look at scope 3 impacts or value chain impacts in agriculture. So if we're going to talk early adopters, I think sometimes it's helpful to talk about where there's maybe remaining benefits to bring them to the table in the ecosystem credit marketplace. But it's also helpful to remember that this isn't the only tool in our toolbox and that we might have to look to other solutions for other types of participants.
Well, I would like to add the same point I mentioned to the other question, because, I mean, again, monitoring is the key in my opinion, because, for instance, for biodiversity, it's really important to have like small pieces of land, for instance. So if you already planted in some areas of Europe, it's more common to have, I don't know, hedges or walls in between different pieces of land, which are really doing a brilliant job for ecosystem services, because animals like to be like on the edge of different cultures, for instance. And if you have done that for like 200 years, like in, I don't know, Scotland or parts of other countries in Europe, I believe you should still be paid for that. Because, I mean, why, like, for instance, in Eastern Germany, like the communist system, they removed all the hedges and stone walls, and if you bring them back now, you get paid for it, but if you already have them, you don't get paid for it. Doesn't make much sense to me. So I believe we should really try to honorate any kind of ecosystem improvement, which is ongoing. And if you do that, going back to your question, you have like implicitly the guarantee that you will be kept being paid in the future. Because if we have this kind of system, if you have a farmer keep a high quality of land, you will be paid in the future as well. And if you remove pieces of your quality, you won't get paid anymore. So I mean, that's like that would inherently bring this component to the system. And also, like, one of your question also was, I believe, like the complexity of for farmers. So well, how should they do it? Like, I believe we need companies or maybe also NGOs, government bodies who take over this process for farmers and simply translate it into actions farmers have to perform. Because otherwise you can't send farmers, I don't know, again, 3 years to university to learn about regenerative agriculture or something. So we need providers for that, in my opinion. Yeah.
I have to say, I was in the beginning very much concerned about additionality, indeed, because you say private landowner who has been doing things in the right way is going to be punished because someone who did it the wrong way can make a much larger profit. And I have to say it was science, and moreover, a report by Indigo that convinced me that in reality is not the case. So the uptake of carbon in the soil is sigmoidal. That makes if you have a very low carbon in the soil, so you did a very bad job in the last 30, 40 years, it's extremely difficult to bring carbon into the soil. If you did a good job, and you're at that upward level of your graph, then it's much easier to bring in carbon in larger amounts. So in a certain way, whoever did a good job, let's say, will make, on a shorter term, much larger profit than those who did a bad job in the past. So I would say from that perspective, additionality is not a problem. If you see that on the very long term, yeah, of course, if you have a completely depleted soil, you can do more. But I think that by the time that the ones who did a good job are at the maximum level, probably the carbon problem is solved.
Maybe a last question also from my side. It seems a bit as if we view this whole biodiversity credits as a bit of a standalone strategy, in the sense that I would like to hear how you see that integrated into other conservation strategies. Maybe you can elaborate a bit on that.
Sure. So I think one of the challenges we see in biodiversity, specifically in agriculture, is that when we look to other biodiversity frameworks that are already out there, like TNFD, for example, a lot of those are using proxy metrics for calculating soil health and soil biodiversity. And so there's, I think, a little bit of a ways to go on being able to have the same kind of direct outcome rather than output approach to being able to actually quantify biodiversity. That being said, the coalescing of the opportunities in carbon, the emerging opportunities in water, the opportunities in biodiversity, taken together as farmers give people a bit of an R&D budget to try to experiment with new practices in their fields, and also to make progress year over year continually. Inevitably, we can't change everything at once. And when you look at some of the practices we're asking people to do, you might be asking people to buy new seeds for cover crops, to invest in different tillage equipment, et cetera, and being able to stack those practices over time, regardless of which program you might be talking about if it, in a given moment, is a really powerful tool for farmers.
Well, I don't think it's a standalone. Let's say if you bring carbon into your soil, then automatically you will have a result also at the level of biodiversity. If your biodiversity improving, there are a number of other ecosystem functioning which is improving. The reason why there is such a strong focus now on carbon farming and bringing carbon into the soil, it's the very first time that there is, let's say, an ecosystem service for which people want to pay on a global scale. And I do think that we need that global market to enable to have a stable market also, because that's the only way that on the long term we can guarantee people who are investing in this also to have a return.
But I mean, I believe it's really important to stress the interconnectivity between biodiversity and carbon, because if you only optimize on carbon, for instance, you might crash your biodiversity because you only plant fast-growing trees, capturing a lot of carbon, but being really highly affected by erosion, for instance. And so it's really important to connect all these ecosystem services and to sync them jointly in order to achieve progress for ecosystems and nature. Yeah.
I also think that it's important, for the buyers, it's very difficult to see the carbon. But when you talk about biodiversity, you can see the butterflies, you can see the birds, you can see the plants, you can see the invertebrates. So it's a direct link, and it helps in, makes the buyer more willing to invest because he can see the results. Otherwise, when we talk about carbon, it's all, testing. So they can see directly the biodiversity.
Thank you very much. I mean, they already said all, and I'm very pleased to be here because I'm listening a lot of interesting information, which I'll further share during the interinstitutional negotiations. But indeed, the objective certainly from the Commission is to have a comprehensive approach. When we look at the priority methodologies to be developed, we look in the carbon farming space as those activities that clearly link carbon improvement with biodiversity. We believe that most of does, but there are also those cases, as you just mentioned, monocultures that would not. And that's why we included the safeguard on ensuring that there is no significant harm on environment, but in additional, the option of for operators to show co-benefits, and the Commission will develop a methodology to report on these co-benefits, because we believe that there will be also a market for these co-benefits, together with carbon removals quantification.
Thank you. Okay, so I think we can open up for questions from the audience. I would just like to ask, if you get the floor, just quickly say your name, your organization, and then try to limit your question to 1 minute, if possible. Yes.
Yes, hello. My name is Alexander Zeyer from the Ecosystem Value Association, and we are building a forestation standard in Germany, the Waldklimastandard. And I want or would like to focus on the additionality discussion we heard right now. So here we're staying in the face of climate change. Time is running out, and we are talking about backwards topics and not so much forward topics. And the additionality discussion I see really critical because it's lacking of this time constraint. So what is additional? Is it additional that we preserve existing ecosystems? Is it additional to foster the development of resilient ecosystems? I would say both. And I'm really missing in this discussion this time constraint. We're losing forests in Germany at the size of 5%, 500,000 hectares are lost. And we have this additionality discussion. What is additional? To rebuild them? Or what is additional in accordance to reshape monocultures into resilient forests, for example? So I would love to hear your opinion. Is the time constraint, so if we speed up, an additional measure for itself?
I'll maybe collect 2 more questions before I hand back to the panel. Yes? Maybe just wait until you have a microphone.
My name is Niels Treschow. I'm a landowner and land manager in Sweden. I think this is very, very interesting what we are talking about with the carbon capture. But the thing, we are using a certain scientific method today to measure something that we do. Maybe the scientific methods will develop and change in maybe 10 years or 15 years and say, okay, if we collected 10 at this point in time with the scientific methods we have today, maybe it's just 5 when we come to the new scientific methods, or plus 5. Who is standing that? I mean, who is paying, who's going to pay who for that when we are using a new scientific method in the future? Who's taking that risk? Oh, and how will we be able to change scientific methods during the way? I mean, who is going to say, now we are changing from A to C?
Any other burning question before we hand back? Yeah, I'll take 1 more, and then back to the panel, and then...
My name is Anna Claverino, sorry. And I work for Aon Insurances. My question is, we've been talking a lot about monitoring and carbon credits. What happens when, let's say, a wildfire or floods or other climate impacts actually completely devastate your land? What happens to the carbon credits then?
Okay, I'll hand back to the panel. So we had a question on additionality. and time constraints, also one on how we can account for the evolution of scientific methods, and then what happens with the credits if you have an unexpected environmental damage happening. So any of the speakers who wants to come back to any of these questions?
I just give quick answers based on the proposal that the Commission has made, but certainly I want to have all the answers. On additionality, very, very clear, we need to promote as much as possible action on the ground. For clarification, we consider additionality as one high-level criteria, but this will be met automatically if the operator uses the highly representative baselines developed by the Commission. So we try to avoid this very complex additionality test that we see in the carbon market, which is creating a lot of administrative burden for very little value. But we want to make sure that some action is additional to the business usual. Certification methodologies, the method that you mentioned, indeed, I mean, this is a general issue, I would say, for all public policy, not just for this domain. You based your assessment and your measurement on the best available tools and methodology you have in certain time, and this will be captured and put in regulation in the delegated acts to the regulation, which will have a certain, they will stay there for a certain period, unless new science comes up that then requires an amendment to the regulation. But we want to ensure some certainty for investors and for landowners, for every actor. You set the rules, and the rules apply until they're not changed. And anyway, there is always grandfathering. So if you're credited under a certain set of rules, this should not change. The role of the risk of human or natural-based reversal of carbon is indeed a big risk. So we propose a very simple principle that for carbon farming and for carbon storage in long-lasting products, the period for which the units are given, so the verified units, expire at the end of the monitoring period of a project. So we do not require landowners or farmers to commit for the same period that you might require an industrial plant to commit, so 100 years or even more. Although I'm hearing here some very interesting message that landowners actually want to long-term, they want to commit for long-term, which sometimes is not the same message that I'm hearing from other agriculture fora. So I think our framework is flexible enough. If you need this long-term financing and you're able to commit for long-term monitoring, you can do that. The monitoring period will be set in the certification methodologies. Could be perhaps 5-7 years for agriculture, for carbon farming activities, could be longer. We see that in the private market, we have much longer, 20 years for forest, can be renewed, provided that there is continuous monitoring. Because what we want to make sure is the carbon is sequestered and then stored for the longest time possible. But of course, we will have to also include some liability rules, some liability mechanisms, and we have a portfolio of systems or mechanism out there. Can be buffers, can be reduce discounts on the amount of credits. All these elements will be discussed in a thorough way through the expert group. The objective is to create an incentive for operators, in this case landowners, to ensure that the carbon remains stored as much as possible.
Anyone else who wants to?
Yeah, I think at a high level, it's helpful to understand that the root of all three of these questions is a protocol question. For any project that you might be looking at that's producing carbon credits that's issued by a registry, each of these questions is governed by the same type of document, which is a protocol, and they specifically spell out what the rules are for dealing with additionality, for dealing with uncertainty, for dealing with permanence. And I'll quickly run through comments about at least 2 of those in whatever time we have before passing this along. The first is to say that, additionality works different program to program. In the protocols we work with, the practice change is key to additionality because that's what we are selling as a carbon credit, is a change in carbon stored in the soil that would not have happened otherwise. Other programs may work differently, but that's the additionality rubric we're working with. There are other additionality mechanisms out there in the market that might look at the potential threat to a forest, that might look at financing, and I'd encourage you, if you would like to go down a protocol rabbit hole, to read deeply on the subject of additionality. We have a policy brief that we've published on this that explains how it specifically works in our program and why. Uncertainty, I think you'll see that any program that's rooted in a protocol has the protocol change more or less year over year. So for example, the project we've listed already and have issued credits with through the Climate Action Reserve has already had the underlying protocol be updated once with some more minor updates. We know it's about to go through a bigger update in probably early 2024. They'll get that process started later this year. And so that effort by the registries is one of continuous improvement to try to keep these protocols in pace with whatever the latest science is. And they're relying on a growing body of published scientific literature to do so. So I do think we'll see protocols broadly evolve year over year so that they're reflecting the best science that is available to the registries and to all the different organizations that provide input to the registries on a year over year basis. So there's a mechanism that exists to do that. There are also uncertainty deductions that projects like ours take to account for example, the uncertainty that we know exists in soil sampling or the uncertainty in an underlying biogeochemical model. So there's a mechanism for that, and I think those mechanisms are built to change over time with the science. Last but not least, on permanence, this is where the idea of buffer pools comes in, and I think it's important to distinguish in between avoidable reversals, where you might have a grower leaving Indigo's project, for example, and we as a project developer are on the hook to manage that reversal. And then you have the concept of unavoidable reversals or catastrophic events, where you have a major flood, where you have a fire, and that's something where you're managing it across a registry and across the market because it is by nature catastrophic. There are a lot of ways to hedge against that. For example, our project is spread out over a pretty large land area, so the potential for a single flood to take out the whole 6 million acres is smaller. We'd probably have bigger problems then, but there are mechanisms in the underlying process that speak to all of these, and I'd say if you want to learn deeply how a particular crediting program is dealing with them, you can go to the source in these protocols and speak with registry staff to try to understand these issues.
Thank you. Anyone who wants to add to that? Not immediately. Okay, then we can have a few more questions. I saw a hand raised there. Yes, I'll let you talk first, yes.
Hi, my name is James Liu from Landlight Company. We don't own land, but we plant trees in biodiverse ways on public land, typically with different public and private landowners. The question is towards all the panelists, but specifically to Gilio and Meredith, is about the legality of, well, it's not legality, but the legal nuance of so-called permanence and durability. So what we run into is indeed some landowners are perfectly able to commit to 100 years out. Some of the landowners says it's not, for example, public forest agencies that says, I don't have the mandate to commit beyond a generation. I can sign a contract for 30 years. I want it to be permanent. So I'm interested in, from sort of legislative perspective as well as contractual perspective, how this can be balanced. How do we achieve our objectives without necessarily signing away so-called a generational equity where, you sign away the rights and the obligations of your next generation. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll go to the...
Hi, Richard Heath from the Australian Farm Institute. We've got quite a mature carbon credit market in Australia now through the Emissions Reduction Fund. And what we're seeing with farmers now is a much increased reluctance to sell credits. And so I want to sort of ask a question in relation to the demand for credits rather than so much the supply. Farmers are still entering contracts and into programs to baseline and accumulate credits, but they're getting extremely worried about the risk that's entering the marketplace in terms of where the demand for credits is going to come from. And it's that competition between private demand and the government auctioning of those credits. And they're just anticipating that the private demand for credits and the requirement for credits to continue to participate into markets into the future is going to be far more valuable to them than selling credits now into any public process. And so they're just holding off to try and manage that risk. So I'm just interested in what the environment is here around the demand.
Thank you. One more is the lady here in the front.
Yeah, hi, Olesya Petrich, WWF Ukraine. We just finished a scoping project about nature-based solutions in water, agriculture and forest sectors. And we discovered that actually carbon farming and agroforestry practices, agroecology practices can help not only reduce carbon emission from agricultural lands, but to apply all of that instruments, we can capture the same amount of carbon that now we are emitting. Yeah, it's actually very promising and good, but in some kind we failed to sell that result to our government and to actually private owners, because landowners, because now we have huge wave of land privatization, and it's land, agricultural lands, it's private and it's growing and growing and so on. And the question was, okay, yeah, and we identified that ecosystem service payment can help to finance that transition. And carbon credits also can help, but we was not able to calculate how much it so we know how much will cost investments in all of that. It's huge. It's unaffordable for state and plus private owners and so on. And the question was from farmers to us, how profitable can be carbon farming, how big will be a carbon credit, and how quick we will return that money that we can or will invest in that. So do you know such examples? And also one more question. So in Ukraine, in our legislation, we have only one law where ecosystem services mentioned in the direction that it should be promoted and something should be developed and nothing more. Maybe you know example like one of the countries where that legislation is good, for which we can see and like mirroring in our country. Thank you.
Thank you. So to summarize, there was a question on the nuance and the need for differentiation, then also a question on competition between the private demands and the public process, and then one asking for concrete examples of carbon farming being profitable. I don't know who can speak, who wants to speak on any of these questions.
I will try to go a little bit into each of the three. First of all, the one on permanence. No mandate after this generation. I would say that's not true. If we look at all of the efforts done at the level of nature conservation, with nature reserves, you have several instruments in that market that make it possible to put something up, I would say, for eternity. Governments are making use of that. Private landowners are making use of that. There are certain instruments which are not always as developed in Europe as in the States. I think, for instance, about easements, which are actually solving exactly this kind of problems. And I do think it's not more difficult for a government than for a private landowner. I think both of them are capable of doing so. I think what is important is that you have the right pricing for that. That if you take a long time commitment also for the next generation, yeah, then of course the pricing has to be right. On the reluctance to sell credits, I would say I cannot blame them. If we look at credits today, I would say, as well in the States as in Europe, we are around $50, 50 euros for a credit. Let's say everybody who is involved in this knows that, let's say, the real price should be at least 180, 185 euros. So yes, the market is going up, and so if you keep your credits, yeah, they will become more profitable in probably in the near future. Let's hope in the near future, but prices are going up. Is it too expensive? If we ask our governments to pay for this, yes, it will be too expensive. For that, I think it's of the utmost importance that the private sector is playing an important role in this, because this is the only way that financially we can solve this.
Yeah, maybe I can add on the question on trees, because like from a legal standing point, I believe it's really important to ensure that, for instance, farmers, if they plant agroforestry trees, they can reverse that land into agricultural land afterwards. Because otherwise it's really hard to calculate. If you plant trees and then afterwards the value of your land decreases a lot because it's not agricultural land anymore. So that's like from a legal point, we have to ensure the continuity for landowners. And for the contractor, I mean, like you already mentioned, for instance, if I rent out my land for renewable energy production, that's also like contracts of 30 years, 20 years, 30 years, and it's very likely that they will construct photovoltaic on that same ground afterwards again. So I basically rent out my land already for several decades. But you will always find both, I guess. So what we see now is that you, in order to onboard farmers, you probably want to start with measures for 1 year, 5 years or so, and afterwards, if they see, well, that works and I really get paid for what I do, they will be rather willing to sign contracts for longer times. Yeah, so I believe that's not normal market dynamics there.
So I'll talk first a bit about pricing, and then I think we can jump nicely into some of the other questions from there. So for starters, we've seen the price of credits increase year over year, as I think many people have in this market. And for us, that's particularly important because we have a revenue share model with farmers. So when we sell a carbon credit, the grower is getting 75% of that carbon credit price, and the remainder is covering our ability to run the program and do soil sampling, et cetera. So as the price goes up, our growers are also seeing their returns go up. And we started that at around $20 US per ton, and that's gone up well north of 40, and we expect that to continue to climb. So it's an interesting place to be from both a credit sales and grower-facing perspective, which then makes it actually very difficult to put an exact finger on how much any grower could make from a carbon credit program over a time frame that's longer than, let's say, a year. Because we have a projection of how that will look over time, but it's exactly that, it's a projection. And then when you couple that with needing to know how much carbon a grower may be paid for, you need to understand the acreage involved, you need to know the condition of the soil that you're starting with, you need to know the practices that a grower might be implementing over a time period. And we do have tools that help growers calculate exactly those things, but it's not a simple, I can quote you one number and you'll have your arms wrapped around it. So I would encourage you to play around with those tools, and also it's exciting then to kind of keep an eye on how the pricing is evolving over time. Then from the contracting perspective, this leads us to a really interesting place because one, the different funding sources that might be available to landowners, country to country, region to region can be very different. Some things are compatible, some things are not. And that's an area where we've seen some NGOs start to step into the void and put out some really nice farmer-facing resources to say, okay, here's what's compatible and perhaps here's what's not. On the contracting side, I think it's also worth noting too that the time frame and conditions that different farmers can take, depending on whether or not they own their land, depending on what the situation is with their ownership and family dynamics, is really different farmer to farmer. This is the first I've heard of 25-year contracts for this kind of thing. We work with 5-year contracts in the US right now, partly as a result of some of the ownership structures of the land we're working on. But when we look at that next generation, there are 2 or 3 things I think we can point to broadly. The first is that the generational dynamics around climate are very different for the generations coming up behind us now than they have been for the fight we've been fighting over the last 10 plus years. To put it bluntly, younger people care about this more. We have to live on this planet after older folks are gone. And so that's one thing we have working in our favor. I also think we have models we can point to of how things have worked in generational handoffs for things like conservation easements, where people have sold perhaps some of the development rights to a property that they own while retaining other rights. We already have actually a fair amount of research and data of how those have played out as generations have inherited that land. And I think it gives us a really nice use case to look to in what we can expect to see in these markets over time.
Thank you. I'll invite 2 more final comments from Julio and from Christy, and then I think we'll have to close. I have the feeling there's still a lot of material for further discussion, but we can continue during the networking event.
I mean, a lot has already been said. I think a quick comment on the cost of monitoring, reporting, verification. Our objective is through this voluntary framework we can support through public-private funding the cost of the certification. I mean, under the Common Agriculture Policy, there is advisory services, there is funding that can support the costs, but also funding for actually supporting the change in activities. And all, in our view, all these would be compatible with the certification. I mean, the idea, we are here setting up a supply-side standard for monitoring, reporting, and verifying what is true, real carbon removal activities and basically ton of carbon removed. They can then be supported and can be used in different contexts. Can be used in the voluntary market, can be used by member states to focus their state aid, can be used by the existing or future CAP strategic plans. It's just a standard there which will indicate to the market and to the operators what can be supported.
Regarding prices, we talked a lot with farmers and we realized that, we thought about, results-based scheme. So we want to protect, okay, what's the cost? If it's under 180 euros, then farmers, they have another option. There are big companies coming and renting land for this amount of money. So if they don't have a better offer, they'll go for renting the land for the highest bidder. So we took it from a sort of different point of view, looking what's the minimum in order to make sure that the farmers want to go into this scheme, and then working out to see what are the options, carbon plus biodiversity, if we can reach this minimum amount, and then also talking about long-term contract. It's another extra point that we can negotiate with farmers, and they will be very happy to have.
Thank you. It's not easy to summarize the discussion, but I think we heard that while these biodiversity credits can provide a mechanism for conserving and also for restoring natural habitats, there are still some challenges that we need to overcome. We discussed verification and standardization. We also referred several times to this additionality and also then to the need for monitoring technology, good protocols, and there are some good examples out there, and also the importance of baselines. We also heard about this need for a very comprehensive approach, not just seeing it as a standalone strategy, but really see how we can integrate this also with other conservation strategies. We also talked about the need for customized approaches and also the need for thinking on the longer term and to think about creative incentives for landowners, and then also the role of the private sector. to make these markets profitable and also to keep an eye on these pricings over time. So I think that's maybe a bit in a nutshell. I'm sure I have forgotten quite a bit, but as I mentioned, there will be opportunity for you to continue the discussion after the closure of this session. Just remains for me to thank, first of all the speakers for sharing their views and their experiences. Also the co-hosts of this event, the European Landowners Organization and the European Networks for Private Land Conservation. And also I would like to thank the people that have been working behind the scenes, Anne-Sophie, Marie, Delphine, Caroline, and I hope I have not forgotten anyone, but special thanks to all of these people. I understood that ELO will also continue to closely follow up on further developments of biodiversity credits in Europe, and also that ENPLC actually will continue. They have a working group on financing private land conservation who will further investigate the topic, and I would also like to use the opportunity to announce that they will have a boot camp in May on funding private land conservation in Europe, where the potential of these biodiversity credits will be further discussed. So very concrete follow-up. I would also like to remind you that the outcome of the discussions will be available, published on the ENPLC channels, also on the ELO website, and also on the magazine, and also, of course, on the Forum for the Future of Agriculture, so on the website. So with this, I wish you a very nice evening. I hope that we will see many of you in the next session, which will be on innovation for the future of forest, organized by the Future Forest Initiative. We will start at 5:30 sharp, so there will be time for a short coffee break, and then of course the networking event that will start at 7. So many thanks.